With Gladiator II coming out this month, I started to reflect on how different things have been since the Russell Crowe original back in 2000. Namely, where did the classic epic go? And more urgently, is it on the brink of cinematic extinction? The more I thought about this, the more I realized that 2024 actually had a fair share of epics, at least my definition of an epic narrative. So, 4 of those are going to be snowballed into the subject of today's video. Those being Gladiator II, Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga, Dune Part 2, and Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. I think it goes without saying, but potential spoiler warning. I'm going to try to keep it minimal just so you guys can check them out if you want to and get an educated opinion for yourselves. So, an epic is more often than not a hero's journey. I can't think of any other plot structure or template that it would have. According to Britannica.com, it's a, quote, long narrative poem recounting heroic deeds, close quote, that also lends itself to other formats, like in this case, movies. It's pretty cut and dry when we look at the plot and the story structure, but I kept thinking, what about these 4 made them such unique viewing experiences? I mean, a romantic comedy can in theory be a hero's journey with morally heroic deeds, so what makes these guys any different? Well, I think for me, I figured it out. It's scale. It's the hero's journey blown way the hell up, and maybe, depending on who you talk to, out of proportion to make the world these characters inhabit alive, full, and abundantly complex. In Gladiator II, for example, that's the Roman Empire, the most well-documented of the 4 worlds because, well, it's the only one that was ever real. But while that has the upper hand over Arrakis, the Wasteland, and America 300 years into the future, they all still struggle with the exact same things that define the genre, making these problems inescapable. Not epics directly, but the payoff they must ultimately provide from a business standpoint. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that producing an epic is fucking expensive. In fact, epics that we deem classics now, like Cleopatra, were financial failures for their time. Good epics are rare, not just because telling a story that is well structured and emotionally powerful is difficult to do, no matter how much you study the craft, but they must also create a profit that makes the investors happy, but not as happy as their wallets. Someone can see this and make the argument that, yeah, sure, it's good, but if it was great, it would have dominated the box office. And Hollywood has a very controversial but effective, nonetheless, answer to that. Let's face it, if these 4 were original ideas, the journey, see what I did there, would be insanely difficult to get them off the ground. Because if you look at it, these epics are all based on previous respected and beloved material. One is a spin-off of a cult classic series. The most recent installment before this one was a Best Picture nominee. One is the 4th installment of a reboot franchise. One is a legacy sequel, and one is the sequel of a book adaptation. And not just any book, arguably the greatest science fiction novel of all time. And that is absolutely by design. I would make the statement that because the hero's journey is so universal, it's insanely difficult to make it unique and therefore a unique product on the market. To put in another perspective, screenwriters are going to need more than just save the cat to make their stories producible. So how do you remedy this? You create what I'm going to call a uniqueness paradox by adding onto previously existing material to show proof that people would actually show up, and as a result, you as a storyteller can bring something new to the table. Though maybe not always. It's also why people rightly claim that Hollywood is unoriginal. Originality is so risky, it's practically a liability every time. But, according to them, originality is what created these assets in the first place. So, risks must be taken. But they must be taken in order to be reformed into a reliable template. Sadly, the people that hold the power don't always recognize this. Epics have a powerful narrative template because of how universal it is. It is quite literally a hero's journey, but on steroids. Main character lives awesome life, people come in and say, haha, no. Main character loses it, main character meets unique people and has unique experiences to restore things as they were, and allegedly they do. On paper, they do. But it's never truly the same as it was before. It's either better or worse, but never the same. The Harmon Circle is the best modern example of this. It helps audiences feel like there was a resolution without feeling like they lost progress in the narrative experience. There's a reason why I don't watch the extended edition of the Lord of the Rings trilogy every day. And that's because it's too much of an investment to make that happen. Typically, the longer the runtime of a movie, the less likely people are going to be inclined to take the time to watch it. There's a saying that if you want to be a director, make movies. If you want to be a writer, make television. So when a film is made as if by a writer, the story can be fully realized at a pace that feels natural to that specific narrative, and not rushed in order to have the same length of something more popular like a comedy. On a technical level, epics can have the ability to really capitalize on the satisfaction of payoff. It feels like a full and satisfying story because it's allowed the time to be full and satisfying. Not to say that you can't do this with a shorter runtime, but it becomes even more important the longer the runtime is. Epics are by design a slow and steady race to the end, with Dune literally being split into two parts, and while it makes them all the more risky, it makes them all that much stronger, because the story structure is allowed to breathe and take up as much space as needed. Is this space always needed? No, of course not. Making a story epic shouldn't be used as an excuse to add plot gunk in between the important stuff, which we saw in some of the epics this year, and if you want a more obvious black and white example, I would say watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy, even the extended edition, and then watch the Hobbit trilogy, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Not to throw shade at Peter Jackson, but there's a clear difference there. But it allows the story to create a complex, but hopefully healthy amount of details to have relevance in the story. In Dune Part 2, that means we can fully characterize the villains and raise the stakes as a consequence. In Furiosa, that means highlighting the most crucial parts of the protagonist's life to act as chapters, but also as narrative dominoes. In Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, that means introducing characters that provide those character-specific experiences to help the protagonist grow and develop into who they need to be for the grand finale. In Gladiator II, that was supposed to mean expanding the political motives of other characters to show us the conspiracies that the main character would be up against. But I'm afraid that it didn't have the same impact as the first one, only because it was, one, done a little too similar to the first one, to where while it was actually a subjectively good narrative and fun to watch, it felt at times like a ripoff of the first, and two, unnecessary in parts to the point where it didn't feel insightful more than it felt bloated. I've also been thinking about making a video separately just on Gladiator 2, so let me know in the comments if you want to see that. Epics have a luxury that very few narratives have: the space and the time to really embody its own identity. A luxury that's usually only reserved for more episodic stories, but it's typically only permitted once the idea is recognized as a worthy investment. which historically speaking, it's usually not. So back to the original question. Are epics endangered? Well, I wouldn't say that. Instead, I would make the claim that epics aren't endangered more than they are unfashionable. Epics had their time in the Hollywood spotlight as the genre golden child, in the same way that westerns and musicals did. Simply put, the industry doesn't focus on that because the numbers don't support this narrative template as much as they had before. Epics like Cleopatra or Gone with the Wind or Dr. Zhivago or the other iteration of War and Peace aren't trending right now in film. Maybe in television, which we saw beautifully with Shogun, but not in film. What is trending in film right now are bright and tight suits and pew-pew hands. Although an argument could be made that we're seeing these be on their way out, and in a surprisingly quick fashion. Not if the mouse has anything to say about it, of course. But the superhero genre being the new black is not a bad thing directly. If we go off of Martin Scorsese's claim that superhero movies are like amusement rides, that may be a good thing if you are looking for an amusement ride. There is a specific value to a trending genre and therefore a specific purpose, but to say that it's universal, I think, is just silly, because it's not. But I think, like westerns and musicals, epics will evolve with the times. They may evolve into the current trends so they can use tropes and structures that have proven to work in a new and contemporary way. We may never have another true John Wayne Western like The Searchers, or a Howard Keel musical like Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, but we can use their influences to enhance the things at the forefront right now, which is how we get gems like Logan or Elvis. But I don't think genres ever truly die out when there is at least someone always passionate about the good old days, with Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight and Damien Chazelle's La La Land being probably the most prominent examples. Now, keep in mind, epics have had more time to become universal than those other two genres. I mean, one of the oldest narratives that we still have record of, we literally call the Epic of Gilgamesh. But because they are so large in narrative, technical, and financial scale, getting enough of these issues wrong is enough for the greenlighters to be weary of making epics more common. And you really have to hit the mark the larger the epic gets. If we looked at all of the information that's been demonstrated in this video and we put them up against the four epics, here's kind of what we get. I think the best of the four, by a pretty big mile when it comes to success and quality, frankly, is Dune Part 2. But I would be curious to see what other people's opinions are on this. But if we go by the Britannica definition, Dune Part 2 doesn't exactly fulfill the definition of an epic because it's really a tragic commentary on the problems of the white savior trope. If we move on to Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga, this one is probably the saddest example on here, because not only did it have the worst performance of the four epics at the box office, despite being a brilliantly told story, but it had the worst Memorial Day opening in 30 years. You combine that with the fact that the creator, George Miller, is 79, and you start to realize not only would it probably take a good while to get the next installment, Mad Max The Wasteland, but this may very well be the last Mad Max movie we'll ever get. If we look at Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, it had a decent performance, though not enough to really be memorable in the long term. And I think with this one, it was a true narrative of heroic deeds, because this narrative actually made a really, really brilliant decision to combine the epic structure with a coming-of-age narrative, which Furiosa also did, And you can make the argument that Dune Part 2 did this too, but I would say Dune Part 1 did that just a little bit better. Again, in my opinion, feel free to let me know in a civil manner in the comments section. It was the most traditional of the 4 epics, but why would anyone care when the story had been done for years? It was more of an unnecessary add-on to the Caesar trilogy than it was an epic in its own right. So, to put it in another way, what good is an investment with no identity? Gladiator II is a rise to power in a game of politics that ultimately ends in a way that the first one couldn't or didn't. But how heroic are deeds in the pursuit of vengeance? That might be the most reliant on opinions of ethics than the other 3, but you get the point. However, I do want to point out that those flaws didn't stop me from enjoying the viewing experiences I had with these. Aside from Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, watching these in theaters was absolutely wonderful. And I had caught myself being invested in the worlds and how the end was going to be fulfilled, even if I knew how it was going to end, or even though my inner film critic would keep saying, I wouldn't have written that line, or, ooh, why would they choose that scene instead of focusing more on this character? It would have given everything a better context. Basically, backseat storytelling. All that to say, imperfections that might have made one genre still great is the absolute downfall of the epic. But, like all of the greatest things, epics won't go extinct when it's their rarity that makes them so incredible of stories, and too valuable and too powerful to go away forever. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you like this, don't forget to subscribe for more videos on storytelling, and check out some of these other videos to get another perspective on the art of the narrative. Until next time, I'm leaving.